Good evening, Edmonton. It's great to see such a fine turnout this evening to the 9/11 presentation. My name is Bob Walton. I've been following the movement for very steadily for the last 3 years when I seen one of Richard Gage's films. My background in construction is since I was 17 years old. I'm 59 now. And I've worked in numerous capacities in the residential, multifamily, light commercial industry as a superintendent, construction manager up in Iqaluit, building fairly large projects up there. I then moved on to building investigations, worked for Alberta New Home Warranties, sat on their structural committee as a conciliator, mediator, and I am a qualified mediator, and did building investigations on some parkade issues up in Fort McMurray. And then part of my role and responsibility was hiring the engineering firms and to do the investigations. It was my eyes at the very beginning that spotted issues and problems with parkades that needed some reinforcement. I'm not an engineer. However, I have worked for all my career with engineers and architects, especially designing buildings way up in Iqaluit and getting the information back. When the Twin Towers collapsed, I was in the office at Alberta New Home Warranty. Our secretary came out and said, Bob, you guys, you inspectors, get out here to the boardroom. And I watched the plane hit the second building, and I didn't see on the TV. And my construction mind, as that building collapsed, immediately back then said, whoa, that can't happen. And that's where my mind started to question, especially when I seen the follow-up media that has been broadcasted over mainstream media and still continues to be. Had my mind doing questioning. I have the honor of introducing who I consider a friend. I've just met him personally tonight, and yet I've watched all of his videos and all of the evidence that he's managed to bring forward to mainly the alternative media part of the world, which I understand now 50% of Canadians, better than 50% of Canadians, get their media now, because it's very difficult to get it from the mainstream media, a thing called truth. So I'm very proud tonight at Edmonton that Richard Gage has chosen Edmonton to be a stop of what is now 17 cities for the Rethink 9/11 Canada tour across Canada. Richard literally going day by day in a very, very hectic schedule. I highly admire him for that. Richard has been an architect for 26 years in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a member of the prestigious American Institute of Architects. He is a professional willing to place his credibility and reputation on the line, like me, and who has endured substantial personal sacrifice. A tireless and tenacious advocate for questions, and if you have any tonight, when he has the question and answer period, please feel free to ask a question. I will have Mike and bring it around, and you can ask his question. Some of the truths that you will see tonight will likely shake the foundation if this is your first time seeing this type of perspective on the three building collapses. Richard's awakening, and I call it an awakening because even as an architect, he initially believed the original story put out of the building collapses, that they collapsed from fires, and until he was interviewed. It was on the May of 2006 on KPFA's Guns and Butter radio program by Bonnie Faulkner in Berkeley, California. And that interview changed Richard's life radically and launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11, inspiring him to found the organization 9/11 for Truth. Mr. Gage has been interviewed on radio and TV over 300 stations and has presented the World Trade Center evidence in more than 80 American cities and more than 30 foreign countries to packed audiences of 100 to 3,000 people whose worldview has been irrevocably altered by this myth-shattering information. I'm certain that the viewing of tonight's film will uphold his remarkable tradition. He is a personal source of inspiration to me. My building career has been deeply involved in the quality of construction and the structural integrity of buildings. I respect him highly as a mentor. I consider him to be a beacon of truth, a patriot, and a friend. Please give a warm welcome, Edmonton. Welcome to Richard Gage.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's really quite incredible to be here in Edmonton once again. I'm delighted. This is the 4th stop of our 17-stop cross-Canada tour, and you're going to find out why, in fact, we are doing just that. You know, hold on one second. There we go. And I want to thank you for your willingness to reconsider the very difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center and a staggering loss of life on 9/11. You know, just as architecture projects are sometimes very difficult, sometimes quite joyful, this particular one has proven to be one of the most difficult. And not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, though, but in terms of the implications of those conclusions. And finding people open-minded and willing enough, like yourselves, to come and to look at the evidence. As you'll see, that's our chief difficult situation here, getting people to actually look. So I'm committing to you tonight to speak the truth and to give you extremely valuable information that you can use to winnow error from truth. That's what we're looking at, learning to rethink and think critically and clarify yourself, fiction from myth. But please check out the facts that you hear tonight. We're not looking for believers. We're looking to have you do your own research and come up with your own informed conclusions. After all, it's extremely important that we understand the whole truth about 9/11. What really happened. It served as the pretext for the invasion of 2 countries in which already over 1 million people have perished. And, of course, 6,000 U.S. soldiers, 158 Canadian soldiers. 24 Canadians died in the towers themselves. If there's any question about what happened on 9/11, then we owe it to ourselves to start and make sure we have a fully unimpeachable investigation into what really happened. Because we have the ensuing global war on terror, the loss of many of our hard-won civil liberties in the U.S. and in Canada with the Anti-Terrorism Act, secret trials. People can be arrested without right to a lawyer or a jury and a trial. It's just horrible. Extraordinary rendition, of course, and torture that we've somehow condoned in the U.S. And a host of other ills that we're suffering from as a nation, and here in Canada too. All of this remains intact if we fail to face the truth about 9/11. And only the truth about 9/11 will stop another 9/11 type attack from happening again. So these are the reasons we must dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what happened and why. And to peer back into this painful part of our recent history. And look at the evidence that we've not seen in the mainstream media. Relatively new evidence. In fact, Time magazine reports that 36% of Americans wanted a new investigation. back in 2006. And they say this isn't a fringe phenomenon, this 9/11 truth movement. This is a mainstream political reality. Another poll in 2007 finds that 16% of Americans believe that the Twin Towers were brought down by explosives, not jet planes and jet fuel. So let's find out where we are before we start so that I can get a sense of who's here with us. How many of us, I'll ask you 3 questions. How many of us believe the official story? How many were unsure? How many already came agreeing with the evidence for controlled demolition? First of all, the official story. The jet planes hit the towers, large explosion of jet fuel, and the fires are ignited and soften the steel, and we have a gravitational collapse down to the bottom. How many of us pretty much there? No reason to believe otherwise. This is what we've been told. This is what we believe the evidence shows. So real high, I'll count you. 1, anybody here? 2, just 2? How many of you are unsure? You might be unsure. You've heard a few things. You're here to check out the rest. Go like this, and I'll be able to actually count you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And how many of you already came agreeing with the evidence that we've been presenting? The rest of you. Okay, so you get a sense of who's in the audience, and so you can run now if you want. No, don't do that. You know, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked with explaining these collapses to us, said they found no evidence for explosives. A year later, they acknowledge in writing that they never looked for it. That's pretty extraordinary. To make a claim, and you'll see a lot of claims made by NIST, how can you find what you're not looking for? This is pretty amazing. Well, thousands of other scientists, architects, engineers, physicists, chemical engineers looked for it, and it wasn't hard to find. And we're going to be showing you that evidence today. In fact, how many architects do we have here today with us? Architects? Any? Any engineers? 1, 2, 3. 3. Okay, any normal people? Yeah, fantastic. Well, I want you to know a sense of, I'm not that normal. I worked on these 3 and $10 million gymnasiums, though, in my 26-year career as an architect, which has been shifting. I'm now devoting 100% of my time to the education of the public and the professions and the media and politicians about what happened on 9/11, what the science shows, what the 2,100 architects and engineers now signed onto our petition, why they're calling for a new investigation. But I've also worked on this $125 million high school project in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from. I've worked on this more recently, $400 million mixed-use project in Las Vegas. And it had about 1,200 tons of steel framing. So I'm not a high-rise architect. I'm not a PhD, not a doctor. I'm just a normal architect who cares about his country. Because as we'll see, this evidence is not just about buildings. The implications of this evidence is what we're going to be focusing on after we look at it. Let's look at it first, though. We're going to be flying through the evidence real quick. This is our website. You can check the website, look at the DVDs, the videos, technical papers. There's a lot of information here if you blink and miss some of the information tonight. But let's first get on the same page and find out what this official myth is about 9/11 and how it got started.
On September 11, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. a myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's pretty much the official story in a nutshell. Now, they took a year or more to actually come to that conclusion. The guy on the street that you heard was that morning, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. So that's why you might have heard some chuckling, because it's unbelievable. I mean, this is the first time a skyscraper has ever collapsed due to fire. And here's a bozo, first one interviewed on the street with a Fox News hat. So that's not evidence, right? But it's just really interesting. I'll be pointing out a lot of interesting things to you tonight. What we're going to do, though, is test the official story with the scientific method. We've had it for 100 years. How does it work? Well, it's not so difficult. I don't know why it took hundreds of years to develop, but we formulate a question. How did the towers come down? I think they came down by fire. Maybe they came down by controlled demolition. Well, we do research to get a sense of which one might be true. Make some observations. Can find a hypothesis. Our best guess as to how they came down. Fire, let's say. Okay, so we test that hypothesis with experiments. We analyze the results, draw conclusions, and if the hypothesis is corroborated by the tests, the experiments, the analysis, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. So others can build on the body of work that's done. This is not difficult. We're going to test and see how NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S., under the Commerce Department, which was under the Bush administration at the time, did relative to open, transparent reporting. And I'll just tell you right now, we have submitted Freedom of Information requests for their input data, for their computer models, which they use to prove how these towers came down, and they will not give it to us. They say it would jeopardize public safety if we were to give you, the architects and engineers who are responsible for designing safe high-rise buildings, the information as to how we proved that the buildings came down due to fire. Whoa! We have a huge problem. So we're on appeal with that. Anyway, let's gather some data and find out what are the forces that destroy buildings, for instance. That's a great place to start with background research. We know that fire destroys buildings. It goes through a building, say a high-rise, which it's never destroyed, even though we have much hotter, longer lasting, and larger fires in these buildings in the last 100 years than we had on 9/11. So, but not one of them has come down. But say in a wood frame building, fire would go through an area every 20 minutes or so, burning that area out, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So the structure is compromised in an asymmetrical way. And so the building, if it was going to fall, would fall over. It's a chaotic organic process. So keep that in mind, because we're going to be looking at how these buildings came down. Was it chaotic? Was it organic? Steel buildings, there have been tests done. And it's actually remarkable what those tests show.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Fascinating. Let's just look and see if that's actually true. Los Angeles burned 3.5 hours over 5 floors. Philadelphia burned 18 hours over 8 floors. And Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. None of these buildings came down. This is important information, and it should be done in a body of research. Now, these buildings came down. What brought them down? Earthquakes. But we see the building in a mass crumpled up somewhat at the bottom of the building. But the structural elements are not dismembered from each other. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So I want you to look at buildings that have come down and compare them to the ones at the Twin Towers and the third building, which we'll be talking about. These buildings exploded. There's thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds that comes from volcanoes where thick solids are pulverized and suspended in air with a thick line between the cloud and the sky, if you will. The cauliflower shapes are unfolding due to the massive chemical reactions occurring, in this case, with explosives. There's witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have those things, those characteristic features, you know that you have explosions. So you can begin to see that we're talking about explosions versus fire in terms of what each is capable of. Explosions are quite capable of being efficiently contained in thousands of charges to bring buildings like this down to the ground. We have hundreds of examples throughout the U.S. and around the world to look at. What they do is place these charges in synchronistically timed on floor by floor, thousands of them, to take out the column to beam connections and shatter the structure into manageable lengths so that it's ready for loading and shipment. So this is only a feat that only a handful of companies can accomplish in the U.S. That fire never has. So what explosives can do versus what fires can do is what we're really looking at here tonight. And there are some typical features of controlled demolition. Sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure, usually, and then timed all the way up. Straight down, symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint because the column waves remove those column supports. Demolition waves remove those column supports, resulting in a free fall acceleration. So the building's falling freely because the knees have been knocked out from underneath it. There's no resistance from any of the columns because explosives remove them all at once. There's a total dismemberment of the steel structure ready for loading and shipment. Minimal damage to adjacent structures. It's quite controlled. There's witnesses that hear sounds of explosions and see flashes of light, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete, and explosions that go off maybe at the wrong times, but they're easily visible as explosions. And we have, of course, evidence left behind in the rubble pile of chemical evidence of incendiaries or high-energy explosives. So these are all direct evidence of explosive destruction, and fire can't create any one of them, let alone all 10 of them. So with government documentation, experts agreeing, those experts who don't have a stake in $10,000 or $100,000 annual contracts with the federal government so that they might be more inclined to speak the truth, unbiased experts would provide additional help. Foreknowledge. These are planned months in advance, so people know about it. This, with video documentation, this is all proof of controlled demolition. Now, oh, cute. This is our VGA cable. Hang on one second. Always screw in your VGA cable. All right. Correct. Bingo. With that in mind, let's look at the third skyscraper to collapse on 9/11. Most architects and engineers know nothing about it. I didn't until 8 years ago. And yet it's the third worst structural failure in modern history. So it should have been the most studied building failure ever, because the Twin Towers were already quite well studied, but it's been swept under the rug, as we'll see. How many of you were relatively, like me, unfamiliar with Building 7? Relatively unfamiliar? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Okay, shall we look at it? It's a 47-story skyscraper, taller by maybe 5 or 10 stories than the Telus building here in town. So you can just imagine the Telus building for our example tonight. When we look at its destruction, it's about a football field in length away from the North Tower, of course dwarfed by these towers, incredibly sized towers, the tallest buildings in the world. But even World Trade Center 7 would be the tallest building in most of our states. Now, it wasn't hit by an airplane like the Twin Towers, so that's why we're going to look at it too. It's an isolated case study, which allows us to really see without all the hysteria, the shock and awe that's associated with the death occurring with the Twin Towers, because theoretically nobody died in Building 7. He had evacuated it after the planes hit the towers. So let's then take a look at this building, which survived the destruction of the Twin Towers. Got hit by a few beams, but NIST says that wasn't a significant factor in its collapse. Nor was diesel fuel, because this building had some diesel fuel in it, because it had generators. It suffered, well, I'll tell you what the official story says in a minute. But we're going to be looking at the features of this building's collapse, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction? So let's listen to Dan Rather narrate his first viewing of this and what his reaction is.
What you're seeing are eye shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, here's Dan using his intuition to describe, what he's seen, because we've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas. Maybe you have some high-rises that have been brought down here in Canada. And so what we're going to be doing, though, is trying to figure out why Dan didn't ever mention that again. Why we didn't see, with maybe 3 exceptions, Building 7 coming down on the mainstream media, even though it's the most incredible structural failure, unexplained for 8 years by the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Science. Well, let's take another look. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse? Here's from West Street. Yeah, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. The penthouse goes just a half a second earlier, indicating core column damage, uniform core column damage under it, and then straight down. This is amazing. Well, I'm not quite convinced yet. Here's building 7 on the left, a known controlled demolition on the right, and let's compare. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like one, and no high-rises ever come down due to fire. So NIST should have used that as their first hypothesis. But they went straight for fire and didn't ever seriously consider destruction by explosive demolition. I'm talking about these fires, the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. This is absolutely amazing. Few small scattered fires on the 12th floor, burning at about 3 o'clock. Very interesting. Those fires are said to have compromised this column. Here's how it works. The fires on this floor, these beams, 50 feet long, expand, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column, causing this floor to fall on this one, and then on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and it all caves out inside this building, and then the overall shell of the building, after the inside is gutted, drops in just 7 seconds. Now, there's 12 reasons why this can't possibly work. And I can show you really quick. See the insulation on this beam? It's not going to be expanding. It's insulated. It's fire protected. That's the purpose of fire protection. Also, the beam is tied to the structural slab up above with shear studs, which NIST omitted from their report. But even if that were true, and this could expand and push this girder sideways, it couldn't because it also had shear studs or pins tying into the structural slab up above it. So, but let's say that wasn't the case and it could slide. It couldn't slide all the way off this angled seat because these beams could never, ever expand, get hot enough to expand. They would sag before they pushed this beam halfway off of its seat. But even if that could have happened, this floor wouldn't have fallen this far because of these other girders holding that floor up, framed into it, right? So we wouldn't have had any kind of collapse. But even if that would have happened, this floor probably wouldn't even have touched this floor. And if it did, we would not have seen a pancaking failure at all because these framing systems are so over-designed. But even if that happened, you wouldn't have seen the interior gutted and traveling then laterally through the rest of this football-sized building in just 10 seconds or so, according to the official story, gutting the inside as if you'd gutted an inside of a moment-resisting steel-framed building, it wouldn't pull in and deform the exterior perimeter structure, massively breaking windows everywhere. So none of this makes any sense, especially when you consider the fraud that NIST put on American people by taking off, not showing these stiffeners, which would have actually kept that beam in such a state of integrity that even if it did push 9 inches off, it still wouldn't have fallen because those flanges are supported by the stiffeners. And even if all that could have happened, the fire was out over an hour before this building came down. So it could not have been responsible for the real-time expansion of those beams because that expansion occurs during the fire, not an hour after. So that's our main problem with NIST, but really it goes on because this is their computer analysis proving that how this all happened. But it doesn't look anything like the video, which is reality, right? It starts to tip over after 2 seconds. In fact, they stop it at 2 seconds. They will not show what happens after 2 seconds because it is starting to tip over. There's 400 structural steel connections failing every second through this building in order to get it to fall as fast, almost, as in reality. So we have some serious problems. It's like shooting a hose on a sandcastle. No structural system is going to give it up that fast. They actually modeled the failure of those connections fraudulently in their computer model. So how do you get a building to fall symmetrically anyway? You have to remove all these columns virtually at once. We're talking about 80 columns that are 3 to 5 times stronger than they needed to be to hold this building up. And all of them have to fail virtually all at once. That's what we're asked to believe by the official story. Fire doesn't have this level of precision. We talked about that already. And how fast is the building falling down? Well, it's falling very fast. You can see it gaining downward momentum with each second of its under 7-second collapse, fitting the free fall curve exactly. What does that really mean? Fascinating. Oh, that means this is what here's a brick. I'm going to drop it. 3, 2, 1. It's falling that fast. Free falls. There's no resistance under the brick. That's how it can fall at free fall. This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel framing. Okay, so you're getting the picture. And we have a problem here. It's as if 8 stories, because that's the period of time it fell at free fall, which is a third of its fall, which NIST at first denied for 3 or 4 years, then finally admitted after being confronted by one of our members, a physics teacher, David Chandler, publicly, embarrassing them. Then they admit, okay, free fall. Do not admit the implications of free fall. Do not discuss it at all as if it could just somehow go away. Well, the total dismemberment of the steel structure is what's required to achieve free fall, and that's what we see at the bottom. It's like a house of cards. Only 4-story pile. This is 47 stories with moment-resisting steel frame, very integrally locked, welded beam-to-column connections. We should have seen a 20-story pile if there was any kind of a real organic collapse, like you see here, for instance, where the structural members don't just disengage from each other in these natural collapses and earthquakes in those cases. Do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Well, here's one, Air Force medic Kevin McPadden.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Fascinating. Well, there's a couple more. Here's Barry Jennings. He worked in the 23rd floor of Building 7. They had evacuated it after the planes hit, but he goes back up into the building. And this is what he and the attorney for Mayor Giuliani experienced.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run. What?
Wow, more information of bombs like this one?
Yeah, here's one of the guys you can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, look. You want to call your mother or something?
This is the afternoon of 9/11. None of these explosions are a part of the official story of Building 7, which came out 8 years after 9/11. That's extraordinary. This is supposed to be the most advanced, thorough investigation in history. They interviewed thousands of witnesses and thousands of hours of videotape. Do we have chemical evidence of explosives or incendiaries? We'll come back to that point when we look at the Twin Towers. For now, it looks like we have direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these. This is very interesting. Fire, like the one in Building 5, thoroughly engulfing the building. If anyone was going to fail, it would have been this one. Did it? No. Steel frame high-rises, mid-rises don't fail due to fire. It just doesn't happen. And not even this one in China, 2009. Completely engulfed floor to roof, every floor. Did it fail? Here's before, here's after. Slightly toasted around the edges, but that put back into use. And yet these few small fires brought this building down in under 7 seconds into a pile like a house of cards. Complete destruction and shattering of the structure. Give me a break. How about FEMA? FEMA was on site with its investigators, and in 2002 they produced a report. They had $600,000 of funding. Here's what their conclusion is. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Whoa! The best hypothesis, fire and random damage, has only a low probability of occurrence. What do you do when your best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence? You go back and find one that can stand up against the experiments and the data. But they say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. So NIST comes in, throws out a lot of the important research that FEMA did, and we'll see what they threw out. In addition to the destruction of evidence, which FEMA appears to actually be partially responsible for, 400 truckloads a day, 99.9% of the steel is shipped to China for recycling. Bill Manning decries this. He's the editor of Fire Engineering magazine. Crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But of course it didn't. And so we have experts, again, those who are not in line to receive federal contracts anyway, talking about what really happened. So here's Danny Jowenko. Somebody brought him a laptop and showed him Building 7 going down. He said, do you know what this is? Here's what he says, not knowing that it was on 9/11. It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. Professional work, without a doubt. Wow. The top European controlled demolition expert. And 80 structural engineers signed on to the petition at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, demanding a real investigation. This one, Kamal Obeid, says a localized failure in a steel frame building like 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a patterned loss of key columns, several of its columns at key locations within the building. Wow, that sounds like fire? No. Foreknowledge? Again, we know about these. It takes months to plan, execute, place these explosives. Well, these mysterious construction workers are listening to, or they're walking away from Building 7. They hear an explosion, look back over their shoulder, look straight into the CNN camera, and say this.
Keep your eye on the building, it'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Pull it back.
All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. Hopefully, debris coming down.
Wow, the building is about to blow up. Where do they get that from? Do fires blow up buildings? This is pretty interesting foreknowledge, but even better than that is Kevin McPadden. Shut up. Kevin McPadden, before he talked about those explosions, he and others were moved 6 blocks back and from Building 7 because they're saying it's got structural damage, it's going to fall down. And so he's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Something else is going on here. It's extraordinary. In fact, the BBC was all over this story immediately. Actually, 20 minutes before it happened, they announced its collapse. And the reason for it, structural weakening due to the Twin Towers debris. Wow. 20 minutes before, they apologized for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does this make them psychic? Well, what's going on here? Better than that, CNN. Go USA! Announced it at 11:07 a.m.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down.
A firefighter rushed by and said 50 stories went down. There's no other 50-story building that went down. There's no other building besides the Twin Towers that went down. There were some buildings that were partially crushed when the Twin Towers went down, but they didn't even fall down, even though half of their structure was completely crushed by these falling beams. Now, had Building 7 come down at that time, 15 minutes after the Twin Towers, would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud created by the Twin Towers when they came down. So many researchers of 9/11 speculate that it was supposed to come down at that time, but it was a dud, a controlled demolition. Something went wrong. So they had to, mysterious construction workers going back in, fixing it, knowing it's going to come down now, hearing an explosion or the beginning of explosions. So that's speculation. But it's interesting, isn't it? It helps us put this thing together a little bit better. Well, the question now is, at least for you, relative to Building 7, is the hypothesis corroborated? Are the features, at least 8 of them, of controlled demolition giving you direct evidence? Do you believe fire can be responsible for these features? With additional corroborating evidence, is this proof to you of controlled demolition? So let me ask you those same 3 questions that I did about the Twin Towers. Everybody has to vote now. And be honest with me. I'm being honest with you. How many of us believe that Building 7 came down by normal office fires, according to the official story? How many normal office fires? Nobody? Nobody believes? Your friends to the south, our government? How many of you are unsure? You might be unsure. That's reasonable. Real high so I can count you. 1. 1 unsure? So how many of you think this came down by controlled demolition? Okay. That's a lot. Guess who has the problem here? Not the one that's unsure. It's you guys that are sure. He's got a safety valve. Who's in this building? Tenants. Let's take a look. The IRS, the CIA, the Secret Service, the Department of Defense, Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management. This is a very highly secure building. Do we think Al-Qaeda got in there to set these explosives? Unlikely. I'm not going to say for sure. I mean, I don't know even who Al-Qaeda is. You can find out who they work for, but that's another story. Securities and Exchange Commission was in here on the 12th floor where the fires were worse. They lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases they were actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. Okay, so that's another area outside our purview for researchers that's fairly interesting. So it appears that Building 7 was some sort of an inside operation. And that's scary for most of us who are new to this information like I was 8 years ago. Why would they do that? Okay, we'll speculate about some of that. What I want you to speculate on is what you're going to do with this information. And we have some options. Some really easy ones, actually. You can sign up for our free monthly email newsletter. Would you bring the clipboards and the boxes forth, Bob? And I want to give you an opportunity to sign up because we will put out monthly the information, our best efforts to get an investigation, and our latest evidence that comes forth. And as well, here in Edmonton, there's a group of activists you're going to be meeting during the question and answer session. And so I want you to have the opportunity to know what's going on with screenings and films about 9/11 and so forth. So these clipboards, Bob will start one in this section, one in this section, and one in this section. And then I also want to give you the opportunity to support AE 9/11 Truth because we're an organization composed of volunteers, and we're a nonprofit organization, and our hands are tied for lack of funds. So I want to make sure that if you feel that what we're talking about so far is important, and it'll get a lot more important in a few minutes here, as we heat it up with the Twin Towers, then I'm giving you an opportunity to support us to another level beyond the ticket that you purchased. This is not required. This is just if you feel the urge to do something more than you've already done. This isn't a church. Don't feel guilty. Just pass the box if you've already done your part. And so Bob will pass those around. The other thing you can do is help us put pressure on this MP, Paul Dewar, of the NDP party, who has been handed a petition by Canadians signed 1,400 times. And we want him to read it into Parliament. And that's his legal responsibility, which he is shirking at this moment. So you can go to tinyurl.com/petition-NDP. tinyurl.com/petition-NDP. Or go to rethink911.ca, and in about 5 seconds, there's a pre-formatted email that'll get sent with your name on it to Paul. And that's what we need your help with right there. So while you're considering that or doing that, I also want you to know that we created an exceptional DVD, which we screened here, I think in this room, 2 years ago. And when we did, a lot of people loved it. And so I want to show you the film. I want to tell you that you can get it tonight for $10 in a DVD. And it's just this is just the 2-minute trailer of the film.
Conspiracy theories, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten, zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
So I certainly encourage you to look at the DVD, which has 43 technical experts, high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolitions experts, all laying out the evidence. Just $10, it's in the back. Also, Ed Asner narrated a simple, little, ingenious 15-minute mini documentary on World Trade Center 7. It's also in the back, and tonight it's $5, not $10. And so, with the awareness that Building 7 went down as a controlled demolition, shouldn't we at least be suspicious about what happened at the Twin Towers? And I certainly was, and so I began to look at it, and I first became aware that there are some people who really liked their design. I wasn't one of them. They called it simple, pure sculptural forms. Others, like Robert Stern, famous architect in the U.S., calls it gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude two squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world, outdoing the elegant Empire State Building with its unfolding Art Deco form. Too bad, really. But besides that, we have an ingenious innovation with engineering in the Twin Towers. What they did for the first time in skyscraper history is to group the columns around the elevator shafts and then have an exoskeleton, if you will, a very thick, massive exoskeleton that is actually responsible for keeping that building from blowing over in 140-mile-an-hour winds. As a result, that exterior structure can actually hold 20 times the live loads that it would otherwise, and that other buildings do. So it's extremely strong. In fact, the core, 47 massive core columns, 52 inches by 22 inches, almost solid steel, and then down at the bottom, and then thinning to 2 inches thick at the mid-height, and then only 3/8 of an inch thick up top, because there's a lot less load that it's carrying. So conceptually, it's like a pyramid in terms of its structural strength. The lower you go in the building, the massive steel, because even on the exterior, these 14-inch thick box columns get almost solid steel down at the bottom also. So there's more steel in the face of this building than there is glass. It's extraordinarily strong. And inside, we're talking about 100,000 tons of steel in this building, a huge heat sink that would draw heat away from any fire, keeping that steel from getting to its critical half-strength point where it can begin to soften and fail at 600 degrees or so Celsius. So that's never going to happen. So that's one of the key reasons why skyscrapers have never collapsed due to fire. So we have Flight 11 hitting the North Tower at 8:46 in the morning, and about 102 minutes later, it fails. But after it's hit, the South Tower is hit, and just an hour later, it fails, or is caused to fail. So some people think the planes hit the towers and the towers went down. It's the planes that did it. No. NIST themselves say that the structure resisted the plane impacts just fine. There was an impact, there was some column damage, but that was not the cause of failure. The structure is very redundant, and they praise the engineers. It's the fires, and not the jet fuel. By the way, the jet fuel, 90% of it, they say, burned up outside the building. The remaining 10% burned up in 10 minutes. After that, we're talking about normal office fires. So just like Building 7, then almost, normal office fires with some jet plane impact damage. The jet fuel, which is basically just kerosene, it just started the fires like lighter fluid starting a charcoal fire. Eventually, it's just gone pretty quickly, actually. So that's pretty important. So these normal office fires cause these more vulnerable lightweight trusses to sag because they say the planes knocked off the fireproofing. Now, sagging trusses do not cause much of a load on these perimeter columns. That may not be intuitive. Most of the load is down on this column. So what does NIST do? They impose an artificial 5,000-pound load on every perimeter column in order to force them to fail in their computer model. So their computer model can prove that sagging columns caused the structural collapse. Anybody have a word for that? Fraud. There is no other word. Thank you. So we're going to look at the direct evidence. Instead of looking at what fires can or can't do to a building or planes, all of that is irrelevant. We're looking at evidence for controlled demolition. That's what we want people to answer to. Do not argue with structural engineers, fire protection engineers, firefighters, or anybody else who thinks they're any of those things or thinks they're smarter than you to argue about anything other than controlled demolition evidence, because there's a massive amount of it, and that is the point. And it starts not at the base of the structure, but at the point of jet plane impacts. This is a magic show that we're being deceived with. They want us to visualize the large fireball and the jet planes and think that that's the cause of the fire. But what's going on underneath, behind the scenes, you'll see in a moment. And there are sounds of explosions. There are flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. In fact, 118 of them are recorded. And these are in the oral histories, which the city kept the American people from seeing, but the New York Times sued them, and finally it got released in August of 2005. Before that, we didn't know what these 500 people were saying. And they were transcribed, and 118 of them are talking about flashes of light and sounds of explosions. Shook my bones, one of them says. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. It's hearing the noise and then seeing the debris. It's not the building collapsing causing these noises again and again throughout these 100 examples. I'll read all of them to you. No, I just got a couple. Was an explosion under the South Tower, one floor under the other. Figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. What are they talking about? Here's the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. So we're talking about bands of explosions, which you can see over here and over here. Is there any similarity between these two? Sudden onset of collapse? Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Once again, NIST goes straight for the fire hypothesis, avoiding the evidence which you're looking at now. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Somewhere in the middle of the World Trade Center, there's this orange and red flash coming out. The flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Well, here's the South Tower compared to a known controlled demolition. Sudden onset, bands of smoke clouds that look like explosions, the leaning of the building toward the path of least resistance. Is there any similarity? Pretty obvious. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive.
We started running floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Wow, are they credible? Well, let's just do a physics lesson to try to get a handle on this. We're going to run a Volkswagen into a Mack truck. Now, according to Newton's third law of motion, which was suspended on 9/11, but normally we would expect an equal and opposite destructive force. And so we would expect the bumper of the Mack truck to sustain damage and the Volkswagen to be totally destroyed, because we would never expect the Volkswagen to destroy the Mack truck. It doesn't matter even if we drop the Volkswagen on the Mack truck. Okay? The lighter part of a structure cannot destroy the much stronger, heavier, intact part of the structure below it. It can never happen. This is as far as you need to go, actually, in your arguments with people who don't understand what you're saying or don't want to. The North Tower, in fact, does just that. This is the Volkswagen. It is being destroyed in the first 4 seconds. There's no movement downward until there. Let's take a look at that just once more. This is the lightest part of the structure, and it is being destroyed right here. What happens after that is very interesting. But in the first 4 seconds, this block is being destroyed, liquefied, shattered, its structure. Something is doing that. It is a series of explosions, which we're actually seeing some examples of already. And here you see directly in the stop, bands of explosions symmetrically wrapping around the building, and which are responsible for its decay. Destruction. So let's take a look now. This is the official theory that this upper block drove the rest of the building down. No photos, no videos show any such block after 4 seconds. There's something else is happening after 4 seconds. Let's take a look at that. This is the tower. This is the eruption, volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea. Is there any similarity? So something's going on after 4 seconds that's very explosive. Geometry of fireworks. Lateral ejections of structural steel elements trailed by thick pyroclastic clouds indicating there's something burning on the ends of them over here. And really a geometry of fireworks, pulverized concrete, and so forth. We'll get into that. That's very important. Does it even look like a collapsing building to you? This is that same building, but underneath. There are a violent series of ejections occurring here, and look down in the lower right corner. You will see racing down the corner of the building, series of explosions way ahead of the zone of destruction, the pancaking collapse that we're told is going on up above. This becomes very obvious. So how symmetrical is this destruction? Here's the width of the tower, And it is quite symmetrical all around. Geometry, again, of fireworks in a 12 to 1,400 foot diameter about each of these buildings, well beyond the boundary of ground zero, completely destroying the beautiful winter gardens 600 feet away from the tower, shattering the structure into its individual components. Here's building 7, the nice, neat pile, a classic implosion. Minimal damage to adjacent structures. Versus the very explosive event known as the Twin Towers after 4 seconds. So do we have these explosive charges going off? Yes, and we're told these are puffs of air, but they're obviously pulverized building materials. We're told that this air, but there was this giant piston, right, that block, which we just saw wasn't there, but if it were, it would be pushing air down and it would come, say that's the core of the building, the elevator shaft, that air would be coming across this open office planning that is the new hallmark of the Twin Towers engineering. And then these windows on this side, that air would blow out all the windows, or none of them, but not these highly accurate, pinpoint, accurate bursts that obviously are in some kind of engineered pattern, which are bursting out at 160 to 200 feet per second. These are clocked by physicists. And so these are explosively propelled speeds, 20, 40, even 60 stories below the pancaking area. Pretty amazing. So how fast is the building coming down? Well, let's count. Here's 2 seconds. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. In about a dozen seconds, both of these buildings are destroyed from top to bottom. Now that is nearly this fast. Turns out to be about 2/3 of free fall. It's still accelerating faster and faster each second, straight through the path of greatest resistance. The 100,000 tons of intact cold hard steel, of which there's a lot more there than is even necessary to keep that building up. Something's going on. Something's removing that steel. Total dismemberment of the steel structure? Yes. We have completely shattered steel structure well past the perimeter of the footprint. In fact, let's look at the south tower. It starts to lean, as we saw. What's happening is it's leaning, has a sudden onset of destruction, and it starts to tip over. That leaning is 22 degrees. We would expect it to continue its angular momentum and fall on the ground in some massive heap. But it doesn't do that. It settles back and goes straight down into the building, disappearing in this massive pyroclastic-like cloud, indicating that its structure is being shattered. In fact, you can actually see that in this rare video clip. What are we looking at? A pancaking collapse is supposed to be going on up here. So, are these explosions? And does this look like a gravitational collapse? Intuitively, after seeing this a few times, you get a sense that, wow, I don't see a building collapsing, I see a building blowing up. Lateral ejection of steel is the result of lateral forces. These freely flying structural steel sections are landing 300 to 600 feet outside the perimeter, and you can see that they are freely flying, particularly this one, which is going out at 45 degrees. Now, it started going straight out. Gravity takes over and it starts to go down. That's how you get 45. What are the forces pushing it out? Gravity works down. So something else is going on here, allowing the winter gardens to be completely destroyed. And the heaviest sections from the mechanical floors, which were highly reinforced, actually going out the farthest. Very interesting. There's enough explosive energy in each ejection here to fire a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. So this is an analysis that can be done, worked on further but we have 110 floors in the Twin Towers, each of them, and those floors are an acre in size. Huge. The size of, I compare that to a football field. I think it's half of a football field. So they're missing. There's a 2-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns here. Where are the 110 floors? We would expect in a pancaking collapse like this one to see them, at least 20, 30, 50 of them. Maybe they're completely mangled, but they'd be there. And 220 acres total of galvanized metal decking that they pour the concrete in originally, that's missing also. You would expect that to survive a collapse. That's pretty amazing. And what about all that pulverized concrete? Well, it's not down at the bottom of the pile. 90,000 tons of concrete flooring are missing. They're being pulverized in midair, well before they hit the ground and crack into 1,000 pieces. They're being pulverized up here to a fine powder, 100 micron thick particles, very fine dust, in fact. This concrete is laid river to river in a 4-inch thick blanket all across lower Manhattan. 30% of the dust is concrete. That's where the concrete is.
And there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
Well, fascinating. And what was found in that dust? Something very interesting that NFPA says you should look for. In fact, NIST helped write the NFPA 921 originally. So they know what's in it. They know it needs to be followed. They know it's the authority for fire and explosion investigation. Did they follow it? No. It actually says look for thermal effects, because that would indicate incendiaries, expanding and pressure waves. So these thermal effects are responsible for, well, they're associated with extremely high temperatures that officials find in the Twin Towers piles and in the pile of Building 7. In fact, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 1,400 Celsius. These are incredible temperatures. Fire and jet fuel can only burn at about 1/4 to 1/3 normally of these temperatures in office fires. You can tell by the thick, dark black smoke, for instance, in the Twin Towers, and Building 7 wasn't burning much hotter. So we have a problem trying to account for temperatures like this. In fact, president of the cleanup company, Peter Tully, says he saw literally pools of molten steel. In fact, there's molten iron is what it turns out to be, pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. Well, this is bright yellow, bright orange color. We know by those colors that it's not melted airplane, which is what NIST says this must be. Molten aluminum is silvery in daylight conditions. It doesn't glow like what you just saw. So we know it's iron or steel, and it turns out to be iron because FEMA actually documents the invasion of the steel by molten iron. We're going to find out where that came from. But look at it. Normal office fires, jet fuel, which is just kerosene, does not melt steel. Never has happened, never will. In fact, steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partially evaporated. 2,000 degrees Celsius temperatures are indicated in the evaporation of steel. In fact, this is documented very well originally in FEMA's investigation, Appendix C, in the 2002 report. They document the invasion of molten iron in the steel. And NIST came along, as I mentioned, took over this investigation, threw out this entire forensic evidence, melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. This is a beam from Building 7. The museum in New York contains previously molten concrete. I didn't even know concrete could melt, but this concrete melted, wrapping itself around the pistols that were in the basement of World Trade Center 6. And these temperatures require 3,200 Fahrenheit, maybe 1,500 Celsius. Fascinating. Where did that come from? Well, this gentleman says it doesn't even exist. He's the co-project leader for NIST and the NIST report.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who says so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
Volcano. Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Somebody's lying here, I think. And so we have an internal requirement to figure out who and why. I'll let you figure out what you think, but this particular gentleman is actually responsible for cutting off this piece and sending it to FEMA originally for investigation. So he's certainly aware of the temperatures involved. He's a structural engineer, for goodness sake, and his shadow is all over the evidence. So we are going after him and his boss, Shyam Sunder, at NIST with legal action on a number of fronts. And that's one of the reasons we need your support, by the way. It's expensive to hire attorneys to follow this through carefully. Now, one of the supporters of the official story says 650 Celsius required, or in the fires themselves. But this kind of phenomena doesn't happen until you get up to 1,500 Celsius. And in fact, what can produce those temperatures, thermite is a possibility, an incendiary. It burns at 2,500 degrees. So why don't we take a look at that as a source of these temperatures and see if it might have been involved in the destruction of the towers. And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere. We've got a source of the heat. We've got a source of the sulfur. NIST or somebody said, well, maybe the sulfur came from the gypsum board. Well, the gypsum has calcium sulfate in it. It can't turn around and attack the steel. It never has. It's designed to protect steel. It's used for fire resistance in buildings all the time. So sulfur came from somewhere else. This is a possible source. In fact, NFPA says, again, look for this stuff. NIST didn't. Others did. In fact, in this powder, officials of the U.S. Geological Survey and R.J. Lee, an environmental consulting firm, find billions of these previously molten iron microspheres, the size of a diameter of a human hair. Billions of them. In fact, up to 6% of the dust is composed of these molten iron microspheres. How did they get there? Do they speculate on that? No. They don't even speculate. And yet, it's such a common component that they call it a signature element. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all these spheres in it. Well, let's step back a minute. If you had thousands of thermite cutter charges in the columns and beams in the building, and they went off under explosive conditions, the byproduct of which is molten iron, what would happen? You would have aerosolized molten iron. You know, not too much different than this, where there's already tens of thousands of microspheres of water in this case, but the surface tension forms itself around forming spheres. That's how it happens. So in the case of thermite spheres, they would cool, fall with all the dust. Maybe before they cool, they're toasting the tops of these cars. There's no other rational explanation anybody's come up with to try to explain that. So there's one hypothesis that these spheres, documented by officials and unexplained, came from a substance like this. Slow motion, thousands of molten iron spheres cooling and falling. And guess what? The chemical signature of those spheres in the dust in the World Trade Center match an experiment very similar to what you just saw with iron and aluminum, the key ingredients of thermite in a 3/4 to 1/4 ratio, but also manganese and carbon, oxygen, silica. Interesting, another team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen collect dust samples independently from several different sources, and they analyze 4 of those, one of them from this apartment of Jeanette McKinley across the street from the South Tower where the windows blew in. All this dust filled her apartment, and she collects it she's an artist. She's going to make an art project out of it. Some of it goes to these scientists, and in each of these independently collected samples, they find the same curious red-gray chips. These are very interesting. Red on one side, gray on the other, indicating they were applied in a fluid, probably. And so what do they contain? Iron, aluminum, key ingredients of thermite in all the World Trade Center dust samples. Carbon, oxygen, silica. This is the red side. They zoom in now with an electron microscope 50,000 times. And what do they find? Rhomboidal-shaped particles of iron oxide. And a nanoscale, particles that are only 20 microns across. This is absolutely fascinating. These, and the aluminum platelets that are 40 nanometers thick are built from the atomic scale up. This stuff is not ground down to size. So what, very, very advanced process. They're set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. Now, because of their small size, they can become extremely explosive. And because they're set in an organic bed of this material, organic material will create expansion of gases. So they have capabilities well beyond those of normal incendiaries. And in fact, at 420 degrees Celsius, they ignite and produce what? Iron microspheres, the same chemical nature of the ones in the World Trade Center. So now we know where the iron microspheres came from. They came from those chips. As if we didn't know, in fact, because the iron microspheres are found attached to some of those partially ignited nanothermite chips. So the evidence is completely internally consistent and self-corroborating. And this would be evidence that would stand up in a court case and put a lot of people, whoever they may be, away for treason for a long, long time. In fact, Los Alamos Lab, Lawrence Livermore Lab, developed this nanothermite, and it was available prior to 9/11. In fact, the people that NIST brought in to handle large parts of the investigation were from defense contractors like SAIC, included people like Foreman Williams, who themselves were working on and experts in the development of nanothermite. So it appears that the investigation has been compromised from the beginning, and we put the wolves in charge of the sheep. This is a very, very sophisticated process. This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. So if we're looking for somewhere to investigate, we might start elsewhere. Then we've got what they need, a 24-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, which is ready for anybody to use in their court case. It has not been challenged in the peer-reviewed with a peer-reviewed paper, and so it remains uncontested in that sense. People will say things like, "Oh, that's just paint." I just showed you some very exotic properties that paint does not have. Okay, the hypothesis we believe is corroborated of controlled demolition. We have 10 key characteristic features of controlled demolition, which is direct evidence of explosive destruction, not fire. With additional corroborating evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition. I want to find out how you feel about it, though. I asked you those 3 questions earlier on. Let me ask again, and again, be honest with me, please. How many of us believe that the Twin Towers came down, according to the official story, by jet plane impacts and the resulting fires and structural weakening by steel? Anybody? Not one of you believes your government to the south? You might be unsure. How many unsure? Let me... 1? How many? Over here? 1? No? Just 1. Oh, in the back. 2. I'm afraid to ask you the next... I'll go on. How many of you think they were brought down by controlled demolition? All right. Everybody had to vote. We have a big problem in this room. Can you feel it? If we're talking about controlled demolition in this building, then we're talking about the controlled demolition of our democracy to the south. Because somebody in very high places had to have been involved. Okay, that's a speculation, but I think it's a reasonable one. We've seen that explosives and incendiaries were most likely used to destroy these skyscrapers, and of course, it takes months of advanced planning and execution to pull off a job like this. Who had the means, the motive, the opportunity to engage in this crime? Who benefited? These are the questions that enterprising journalists and criminal investigators should be asking down south, but are not. And that can only imply that they're compromised to a large extent. And the extent of that compromise is what's so shocking to those of us upon being confronted with this information, especially those of us who were shocked in America because that attack was on us, the USA, to the south. So that's why we're stumping across Canada to enlist your support, because you have a greater capability to step out from underneath that dragnet of media censorship and and judicial infiltration, compromise, corrupt. So we have huge problems. The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth don't speculate about these issues. We don't have conspiracy theories. The evidence you've seen is just a small fraction of the body of evidence which is available that the 9/11 Truth movement has assembled. The questions raised are numerous and ominous that must be answered in a real and unimpeachable investigation where witnesses are offered immunity to come forward, where their testimony is taken under oath, where all the evidence is presented and looked at and analyzed according to the scientific method and not somebody's conceived idea of where they want it to go. So we're beseeching you, our friends to the north, to help us. And there's ways you can, as I've already mentioned. Petition Paul Dewar with a small email, rethink911.ca. You can go there right now on your smartphone. In addition, this march in 17 cities from West Coast to East Coast has already picked up 9 candidates for Parliament in 2015 running on the 9/11 Truth platform. This is an extraordinary development. We had no idea when we started we were even going to do it or be able to do it. 4 in Prince George, 2 in Vancouver, and 3 in Victoria. And so I'm going to ask you real quickly, how many of you would be inclined to look into running for Parliament? All you need is a $1,000 fee, not to me, but to your government, and 100 signatures to initiate a preparatory look, exploration into a possible candidacy. Anybody interested? Right here in this riding in Edmonton or wherever you are. There's one. Big hand for the gentleman. What?
There's a big problem.
Tell us the big problem.
I'm a dual citizen. The United States is the only country in the world that will revoke your American citizenship for participating in the political process of another country.
Oh, so that's a decision you have to make. I respect that. I'll let you make that, but you're going to consider it. And that's all we're asking, right? So that's cool. Who knows? Maybe you don't feel like being a U.S. citizen after seeing this evidence, right? Yeah. Anybody else willing to consider? 1. All right, another one. And 3. Now, what's your name?
Ryan.
Ryan what?
Vale.
Ryan Vale. Anybody know Ryan Vale? Because will you come and talk to me? I want to actually write your name down, if that's okay with you. And we're going to put it in our blog. What?
I was here 2 years ago.
You were?
Yeah.
Awesome. So now ready to march and run. And what's your name? Monica. And Monica is going to give me a ride to the airport tomorrow. So I won't let her. And will you talk to me afterward too? We're going to actually meet anybody who wants to over at a gentleman's house named Khan. He's an extraordinary person and a photographer, and he's got great food. I just had some. And so I'm going to announce this again, but I want you to know, and if you 3 guys could come and we could talk about this a little bit over there, that would be awesome. Because we're going to meet in Riverdale at 10107 89th Street. 10107 89th Street. Ask me again, and I'll give you that address again. So that's extraordinary. Now, we're not going to just let you guys go out there without a connection with each other. Bev Collins, who ran for Parliament on the 9/11 Truth platform in the last election and before, is going to head this effort up and unite you guys. And so it's pretty exciting. It's never happened in our country, in the U.S., so let's see what we can make happen here. Even if you just want to support the cause in one of dozens of ways, like providing information so people can be informed. We've got it all. You can wear a hat and march throughout your riding and talk to people. I don't know how candidates do these things, and we don't, have money to fund your candidacy with yet, but we're gonna help you somehow. Anyway, the DVDs are incredible. As I mentioned, you can get this one for $10, this one for $5, and this one, which is tonight's presentation, for $10 in the back. And there are a number of books that go well beyond the destruction of the Twin Towers and Building 7. David Ray Griffin has written some excellent ones, and many others have as well. We're talking about what about the hijackers? How do they fit into this demolition picture? The airplanes. What's the story with them? The drills, air defense drills that sent our fighters every which way, but anywhere near the Twin Towers or the Pentagon. What about the Pentagon? What happened there? And Shanksville. So there's a lot more to the story. Put options, millions made by people who bet that the airliners would go down the next day, but the 9/11 Commission stopped that investigation in its tracks because it didn't lead to Al-Qaeda. That's pretty amazing, I think. So you can also sign our petition at ae911truth.org. You don't have to be an architect or engineer. You can sign right here. We now have 19,000 others. Pretty exciting. And you can be a local contact. If you go to our website, click on Take Action, your name will be on our website so that people in your area looking on our website find you in their city. That's pretty cool. You just put your email up there, people can email you. And if you want to take it further and be an action group, we're looking for 200 more action groups around the world. People who 2 or more get together, meet monthly, and do something. There's a lot of things you can do. You can table, you can hand out literature, DVDs, you can write letters to the editor, you can sit at home and in your mother's garage, like the rest of us conspiracy theorists, and email everybody and do social media. Anyway, whatever you're called to do, follow your conscience and act. Because if we allow the truth about 9/11 to be swept under the rug of history, we'll have more false flag attacks on Americans, more wars around the world, millions more killed, more economic manipulation, worsening financial crisis, more loss of liberties, and of course, we become a whole lot less safe. Whereas the truth about 9/11 illuminates these lies and results in the rectification of each of these disasters. So we see 9/11 in a whole new light as a means of exposing massive corruption to its heights. More importantly, though, as a way of recovering from its ills. So it's not too late to discover for yourself, where do you draw your personal line in the sand, where you take action based on the information that you've received tonight and up to tonight. Do you wait for the next 9/11? No. Predicted by members of the Congress and the media to actually be far worse than the last. No, we don't have that luxury. Speak the truth now, for a time comes when your silence is betrayal. Thank you for your kind attention tonight. I really appreciate it.